Well, according to the clock and the words, I guess you can say the writing on the wall behind me, we're up to Daniel 5. All right. And for those who don't know what the story is about, I just gave the whole thing away. So, uh, Daniel, we've been looking at, for those who haven't been here, we've been looking at several different stories so far. We're going through chapter by chapter through the book of Daniel. Today up to Daniel chapter 5. This one is, the story essentially tells itself in a lot of ways. There's not a tremendous amount that I'll be able to add to that in other contexts and other times it's referenced, but I think there's still some very interesting things that come out of this that we can kind of take away from it. I've always really enjoyed this lesson, in particular this chapter. I think partially because when you look at it, I remember, and I don't think any of them are here anyway, but I still won't call out their names, but most of them have grown. I remember it was probably, 7, 8 years ago. I remember having a conversation. I think I must have been teaching the high school class or something like that, because I had a conversation with a couple of them, and I made the comment about the writing on the wall and how that's a thing in the scripture that, and I was surprised that they didn't know that story very well. Some of them had never heard it, and I thought, well, that's a shame, so we need to study it. But hopefully that's not the case. I think most of us have probably heard this one. That phrase that comes up all the time, you can see the writing on the wall. You can see that. People don't even realize, that they're quote scripture when they're doing that. All right, so on this one, oops, if I power it on. It's always amazing. The clickers work better with the power button in the on position. And Daniel chapter 5, we'll read through the verses here. King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 nobles and drank wine with them. All right, right off the first thing is we've changed kings here. This is after the time of King Nebuchadnezzar. He just wrote his open letter to the whole world, and we get no more information about him. We don't know how much that stuck. My suspicion, knowing King Nebuchadnezzar's fickle nature, was that it didn't stick for too long. And he must not have instituted any sort of widespread worship of God, because right away as King Belshazzar comes in, which would have been 2 generations down, but not too long after King Nebuchadnezzar, there was a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, which it says father, it's really his ancestor, it's his grandfather. So his father had taken from the temple in Jerusalem so that the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. When we looked at there was a very clearly told to us story earlier in Daniel that he took these items, and I mentioned at the time that he will then be ordered to, through the time when Ezra comes back, they'll be ordered to take the items back. And so they were kind of in protective custody, if you want to think of it that way, so that nothing happened to them back in Jerusalem. A lot of things fall by the wayside and into disrepair in Jerusalem after it's been ransacked and over this time of no real worship going on there, and everything's crumbling apart. And so Jerusalem would not have been the most protective place for all of this stuff. So Nebuchadnezzar, led by God, I would argue, takes away all of these objects. It was known, these aren't a handful of, a couple of things. First of all, he brings them out. There's 1,000 people there. This is not a small little party. He goes out and they start hauling in all of these items from the temple of God. He knew what they were. He knew exactly. He had been in the palace. He knew what he was doing. And so Belshazzar, in no way, shape, or form, is unaware of the snubbing of God that he's doing at this time. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines drank from them. As they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. What worse thing could you think of than to take the items from the temple of God, having this wild, raucous party that you've thrown, taking them and turning them into worship of fake gods of iron and wood and gold and silver and all of these other things. Belshazzar, right away at the very beginning of this chapter, pits himself against God. He takes a stand that he is going to position himself as though he is making a claim very opposite to what Nebuchadnezzar's claim was. What was Nebuchadnezzar's claim last chapter? At the end, when he wrote that open letter, what did he claim? That he claimed that we should all be worshiping God, essentially because God was this greatest, that God was, that he sets people into power and he holds all the authority and dominion and all of these things that we know to be true that he had come into realization of. We see this kind of played out in this just overly poured out understanding from Nebuchadnezzar. And then just a few years later, Belshazzar takes those same objects and basically turns it around and just starts to position himself as, God, you're not actually that big of a deal after all. I'm going to take your stuff and I'm going to praise other gods with it. And you see what, this isn't going to go well. He's using God's consecrated items from the temple to praise his gods. And I say this couldn't be any more of a snub to God of Israel if he tried harder. There's nothing more he probably could have done at that time. As a pagan himself, his entire life was in opposition to God. But to go and take the only things he had access to of God's consecrated items from his temple, which were being held for a purpose. We see that, you can go to Jeremiah and you can see this whole Babylonian captivity was prophesied about. It was planned by God. It was for a purpose. God is at work during this entire time. He is guiding his people to go to Babylon, learn their lesson, and come back a better people. And don't you come back until you've learned what, we've all heard that, right? It's Mother's Day. I could probably quote about the next 20 minutes worth of times I've been yelled things like that by my mom growing up. My sisters and I would be fighting. You go outside and I don't want either one of you to come back into, one of you is not able to walk back in. Things like that. I'd always be told that. And then you go outside and it takes all the fun away. It's like, am I going to fight you? So anyway, the things that you weren't supposed to be doing, and he knew it. He knew exactly what he was doing was against God. He was doing it on purpose. He did it to show off to the 1,000 people that he's throwing this banquet for. And here he is, puffing himself up, making himself even greater than he could. God's not going to look kindly on this. He is not just going to sit back and watch his items that were brought to that city for protective custody purposes to be held in storage until his people got to go back to their rightful place and changed. And they're not going to let some, fly-by-night Belshazzar guy try to be the one who decides he's going to, loft himself up and use these things for whatever purpose he wants to. And so we see this writing on the wall. Suddenly, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale and he was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. I'd like to think that we still would have that same kind of reaction if we witnessed this same thing. We have a lot of things that we can do through computer-generated graphics, all that CGI stuff. We can make drawings and pictures. We could animate them so that we could mimic this on a TV screen. We could show this exactly the way it was. We could even, through holograms and everything, make this actually, if I would have had the equipment and the time and, capability, let's be honest, I would have been able to come up with a way to make a hand appear on the wall and start writing this in there. But the thing about it is, that's all, we know how it happened. We know what programming we wrote to make it look like it was really happening. Put yourself back into a primitive mind. Put yourself back, and understand too, primitive people weren't less intelligent, they were just less technologically advanced. They have the same mind that you would have. They would have the same reaction that you would have. They just haven't seen the kinds of things that we've seen through virtual reality. They only lived in actual reality only. And so what they saw couldn't make these things happen. And there they are staring at this wall as this hand. And I don't know if it was a small hand. I mean, it caught his attention. So I've always pictured it as this, a big wall with a big hand writing there. And there it is. It just starts scribbling away at this. I don't know if a noise was made as it etched it into the wall and the plaster, or exactly what happened on the way it happened. But all we know is that it was terrifying. And as King Belshazzar takes his goblet up there, and all of a sudden this hand starts writing up on there. And as it writes up on there, he doesn't know what it's saying. He doesn't understand what it is, but he has a feeling it has something to do with what he's holding in his hand. I think he knew exactly what he was doing. Belshazzar knew when he grabbed those goblets out of it in the middle of the party, he's like, ooh, I've got an idea. Go get all that Israelite stuff out of their old temple from their God, the one that my grandfather wrote that letter to the world after he went crazy for 7 years and went everywhere around there and was changed. Go get that stuff. I want to show them how great I am. You want to talk about an inferiority complex? You had Nebuchadnezzar. If this story didn't exist, who's Belshazzar? Again, just a completely forgettable king because he's nothing. He doesn't have the clout that was once there in his kingdom. The one thing that we remember about Belshazzar, he ruins it for the Babylonians because of this story. There's just nothing about the guy that was memorable. He tries to make something of himself by going out there, grabbing all that stuff, and as soon as he goes for the toast or whatever they're doing, they're starting to praise their gods of it. Starts writing on the wall. The face going pale, his knees were knocking. I've never been that scared. I don't know. Maybe I should be more. I've always said to I'll say this, I've always been amazed by people who have a scream mechanism in their body. I don't know, I've never understood that. You could startle me all you want. You might get a little bit of a little breathe in kind of a thing. You'll probably get silence out of me. I can't scream. Even if I try, I actually have no scream in my body. I can't scream if I wanted to. I've always thought that would be really interesting. So I kind of more go along with what he did. I think I would stand there just like, almost starting to shake a little bit. I've never gotten so scared, though, so terrified that my knees started knocking. That seems to be a level of terror I don't get. I don't understand, how terrifying this sight must have been. There he is in the middle of everything. His face turns pale. His knees start to knock together. The king summoned the enchanters, astrologers and diviners. He said to these men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing, understand this is not in the language that he gets. He doesn't understand it. He's looking up there. If all of a sudden a hand went up there and wrote in Flemish, we'd be like, we need to get a translator. We got to figure out what this is. I'm supposed to know what this says here. But so he's wanting an answer there. He says, whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around his neck, and he will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom. And you've probably heard the importance of purple for the royalty and everything because of the expensive process it was to dye materials into a purple color, how costly that was. Only the richest of the rich could have it. Now we go for certain logos embroidered into things. That's how we have the high dollar items. Then for them it was purple. If it was purple, it was going to be the expensive stuff. It's not the case today, but in these days, that was an indication of, I'm going to lavish wealth on you. Have a gold chain placed around your neck. You'll be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom. If anybody can just tell me, what does that mean? What does it say? What does that writing up on the wall even translate to? What is it? What is the meaning of it? What's the purpose behind it? Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or tell the king what it meant. So King Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face grew more pale. His nobles were baffled. I mean, this is this party. This started off as a huge party for 1,000, and now it's turned into this source of, we got to find out what this means. What does this mean? You can imagine this kind of this rustling going on throughout the crowd and everything. As everyone watching it were either baffled, the king's terrified. Oddly enough, the others don't seem to be terrified. Makes you really think that the king knew enough. The same way that King Nebuchadnezzar always knew that his dreams were about him, I think he knew that writing on the wall had very much to do with him. I don't know. It doesn't say it. I don't know if the hand turned around and was like, just so you know, starts writing it, and don't forget it. I don't know if it did that. We're not told that. But for whatever reason, Belshazzar knew it had to do with him. You can see it in his actions and his reactions that he wanted an answer for why that was there. He was terrified, while the people around him were baffled, amazed, probably to some degree terrified of what they watched and witnessed. The queen, hearing the voices of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall. "May the king live forever," she said. "Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. There's a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have the insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. Your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners." I always find it interesting, too, how many times these kings have to be reminded who is even in their kingdom in these like high positions. And, third highest ruler in the kingdom, is what he's promising out there. Clearly, that doesn't amount to a whole lot if he's willing to just throw that into it. Could you imagine if we had a vice president? Like how much we've always, I think over all years, again, not a political statement, don't read into it. Over all the years, we've always had presidents, and then the vice presidents, we've always kind of wondered, what do they really do? I think we've all had that question of, what does a vice president actually day in and day out really, really do? Could you imagine a vice president? Third highest? That's nothing. And he's kind of just throwing that out there as something. He's already got that level of authority already to some degree. Daniel was given that by Nebuchadnezzar to have this chief over all these astrologers, enchanters, and diviners, that he was the highest ranking one of them already. And in no way, shape, or form does it seem to ever be utilized much, and Belshazzar doesn't seem to even give it much thought there. So God is going to take this act of rebellion against him, this snubbing him, he's going to turn it into something for the working out of his plan, and we're seeing that happening. So again, we see how God's ultimate plan throughout the course of the book of Daniel is going to be to bring his people back to Jerusalem. He's kind of, I'd say we're kind of seeing the inside workings of the Babylonian captivity. And we see how he's weaving his people throughout this so that things will be perfectly aligned for the return home and that they'll be able to have this happen. So he did this because Daniel, whom the king called Belteshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. This is the queen still talking. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what the writing means. So Daniel was brought before the king, and the king said to him, "Are you Daniel, one of the exiles my father the king brought from Judah? I've heard that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that you have insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom. The wise men and enchanters were brought before me to read this writing and tell me what it means, but they could not explain it." I've just can't wrap my mind around one thing about these stories is why don't they just go to Daniel first? Every single day, when will they learn their lesson? But he is still in exile. And even though he had exalted himself during the time of Nebuchadnezzar, that may not have carried over to the time of Belshazzar. And so again, he's now back into all right, you're in exile again. Well, God needs him into a better standing so that when the next group comes in, he's where he needs them to be. So Daniel is brought in for this event. "Now I've heard that you are able to give interpretations and to solve difficult problems. If you can read this writing and tell me what it means, you will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around your neck, and you will be made third highest ruler in the kingdom." I love Daniel's response to this. Daniel answered the king, "You may keep your gifts for yourself and reward to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means." So I find it interesting that he's basically, his fear isn't there because Daniel knows what it says. He can read the writing on the wall. And so he's like, well, this Belshazzar guy doesn't have much time left anyway, so I'll just tell him exactly what I think. And you can kind of see his response there. As he says, "You can keep your gifts. I don't need that." And he's like, "But I'll tell you exactly what it means." I don't know if Daniel knew what was going on in there. I don't know if it had become known amongst that what was happening, or if he walks in the room and sees the objects and recognizes them. We're not told that part. to know how much Daniel actually knew of why this was happening. I don't think Belshazzar was a stand-up guy that Daniel had a lot of respect for anyway. I think there's a lot of things that this personality type that would do this to the face of God and just do it right before him probably has tried to snub him in the past. I imagine this was not his first go at it. My guess would be, and again, this is all speculation there, is that he had a reputation. And so Daniel automatically doesn't have the same level of respect for him, I don't think anybody did, of what they did for Nebuchadnezzar. And so he doesn't come in there and kind of say, with Nebuchadnezzar, it was always, I wish this was about somebody other than you. I hate to even have to tell you this, but this one is like, oh, you can keep your gifts. I'm going to tell you this one. It's just very different the way he addresses Belshazzar. So, Your Majesty, the Most High, gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Because of the high position he gave him, all the nations and peoples of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the kings wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. Those he wanted to humble, he humbled. I kind of like how he throws that in Belshazzar's face too. Because there, again, I think there's an inferiority complex going on here, and I think that's what a lot of this was rooted in. And so if you look at this, to hear him kind of say like, you remember King Nebuchadnezzar, he was great. He had a lot of greatness to him and what he brought to it, and God put him into that. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like the ox, and his body was drenched with the dew from heaven, until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and sets them over anyone he wishes. As he's probably holding this thing, I don't know how long it took him to get there, but if he's still there with all these objects he had brought in, he tried to put himself up there. He got a little too prideful of himself. He wasn't even actually going directly against God. If you really look at what Nebuchadnezzar was doing, it was all pride. It was never, I'm going to take things in direct opposition to the God Almighty. He never did that. Belshazzar, though, is gone a step beyond the pride into this, I'm going to put myself into position of I am going to completely take all of these consecrated items and do whatever I want to with them because I'm better than God. Nebuchadnezzar got awfully haughty that everything was about him and that he was the greatest one on earth. But we never actually hear the words come out of Nebuchadnezzar's mouth in the same way that we see the actions of Belshazzar. I think he goes a little bit, he crosses a line a little bit more. And Daniel sees that and throws back in his face what happened to Nebuchadnezzar over this. And he goes on, he says, but you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. Again, he's just reminding him of what he already knew. You knew that. You know exactly what all this happened. You remember that letter that was written by Nebuchadnezzar. You read it. You know all this. You know everything that happened here. Instead, you've set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You haven't just been prideful. You pitted yourself against God. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles, your wives and your concubines drank wine from them. If Daniel hadn't heard, by the time he gets in that room, he knows everything. I don't know at what point in time Daniel knew all of this, whether God had told him while he was waiting for them to come, they're going to come get you. This is what they're doing. We don't know how he learned of it because he wasn't in the room, right? He was brought into that room. And he's brought into that room. He sees it all. He now fully understands what's going on, and he throws it back in his face and said, you grabbed those goblets. You know exactly what you were doing when you did it. You went there and you pitted yourself against God. And you had all of your nobles and your wives and your concubines drinking wine out of them, praising those other gods. You praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand, but you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. Therefore, he sent the hand that wrote the inscription. I wonder what his knees were doing then. You wonder too, like at some point in time, he was desperate to get the words translated. I don't think he was ready to have those words translated. And so there he is, he realizes, I think at that point that this was exactly probably what he was fearing, is that it did come from God, because he knew what he was doing there. So this is the inscription that was written. Mene, mene, tekel parsin, or sometimes it'll be mene, mene, tekel uparsin. Again, you look at this and how it's then translated. He sees these words up there, and if this is where the story stopped, we'd all be left scratching our heads like, I have no idea what this means. We need somebody to translate it for us. But Scripture does. It says, here's what these words mean. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you've been weighed on the scales and found wanting. That's a hard pill to swallow for a king who thinks he's all important and the greatest, and he's throwing this big party for 1,000 nobles to puff himself up. And he's like, yeah, you've been weighed out. Yeah, you fall short. And so it's like, oh, that's a little tough to read for him. And then Paris or Parson, either one. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. And so there he sees this. It's like, all right, now he looks up at that words, and instead of what he saw before, what he really sees is numbered, weighed, divided. And he sees that, and it's like, I've been numbered, I'm not good enough, my kingdom's being taken away. I got my answer. So his response to that one is going to be interesting too, that his terror is still there, and it's like he almost tries to buy out of it on this one. Obviously, the world uses this story without even understanding what they're really referencing. If the world knew when they see the writing on the wall, what the writing on the wall really tells them, that it's you better not ever pit yourself up against God, that God is in control, that God is the one who makes the decisions of who's where and who gets success and who everything. When you look at all that, when you see this, that just throwing around flippantly as a figure of speech, if they only knew what they were actually referencing, it's interesting how often you'll hear it thrown out there. Belshazzar is going to keep Daniel and elevate him to this higher position just in time, just barely in time for Darius the Mede to come into the story. Why is that important? Well, Darius the Mede was one of the leaders in this divided kingdom under Cyrus. And so Cyrus is going to write an edict that is going to eventually allow them to come back. So it's a really important piece of that this happens right at the end. God's plan is still at work at this. He's making it things to go from the head of gold, if we go back to the Daniel chapter 2 story, down to the chest and breastplate of silver when the Medes and Persians come in. So we're going from the Babylonian to the Medo-Persian Empire. And we see this happening at this event. World history misses the part where why did the Medes and Persians take over? Because Belshazzar tried to snub God. And King Nebuchadnezzar, who had taken these exiles in for a kind of restructuring of them and for them to have a rededication of their lives to God over time, that he was training them back to the people that had become so hardened. I mean, look back at the times of the kings of the north and the kings of the south, and there was nothing positive in that divided kingdom that was really leading them. Every now and then, you'd get a decent king, in one of the two kingdoms, and that was it. That's not enough. And they were being led away, and he kept telling them, you don't want a king, you don't want a king. Trust me, you don't want a king. No, we want a king. No, you don't want a king. They get a king, and he's like, I told you, you didn't want a king, and now you're going to Babylon. And I'm going to teach you what a really bad king will do on this one. But I'm going to use him, I'm going to lead you guys back, and I've got a couple guys in mind who are going to be the ones to help me accomplish this plan. And Daniel, given this wisdom and insight like no one else, is able to walk into this room to the king over the land of which he's in exile and walk into him and be like, I don't need your stuff, but I will tell you exactly what it says. You messed up. I mean, that's his message. You did this to yourself. You knew exactly what you were doing because Nebuchadnezzar, you saw it all. You watched all of it. You knew it. Those words up there, the numbered, weighed, divided, that's all about you. Your days are numbered. You aren't good enough. You weighed up short. And on top of that, it's divided. Your kingdom's going away. All that Babylonian greatness, you blew it. I mean, that's exactly what the message is to Belshazzar there. In the last few verses, then at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple, a gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. And that very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain. And Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. And there we are. Now we've got ourselves Daniel back into a decent position, and we're going to see how he then continues to do what God's wanting him to do throughout the time of the Medo-Persian captivity. After the Babylonian captivity evolves into the Medo-Persian captivity, it doesn't last for too much longer, and they will start eventually heading back home. But there's still a few more stories before we get to that point. So, anybody have any thoughts or comments on that? I told you this morning most of it would be straight out of the scripture. Did you have a...
The only thought I have is when you know the bad's coming, be careful what you wish for.
Yeah. Well, and I think also, if you're in a position where, where you're sitting there and snubbing God, and all of a sudden a strange message appears to you, you may not want to get that translated so quickly. I know, yeah, that's one of those things that, you really want to know the answer, but don't put yourself into a position where the answer's not what you're going to want it to be. I guess a good lesson to learn from that. So, all right, we'll end class there. Oh, don't forget, for those who are leaving, who came to first service, don't forget, moms, to grab your stuff on the way out. The children's ministry has those gifts for moms out on the table out there.